In the relentless darkness of the 41st millennium, where the light of humanity flickers like a candle about to be extinguished amidst winds of heresy and despair, there existed lost worlds, forgotten even by the most archaic records of the Imperium. One of these, a death world shrouded in a perpetual cloak of volcanic ash and toxic clouds, had become the stage for one man's silent and desperate search. He was an inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus, but his crusade transcended the usual hunts for witches and cultists, diving into a well of myths and whispers that most would consider the most blasphemous of heresies. The Inquisitor, a man whose austere face was sculpted as much by vigilance as by age, moved with the grim precision of a spectre through the desolate ruins of a once robust settlement. His cloak, grey as the ash beneath his steps, brushed against corroded debris, and the ocular gem of his servo skull scanned the horizon for any anomaly. There was no life here, only the persistence of rusted machines and the wail of the wind, a monotonic chorus narrating centuries of oblivion. The dense, metallic, and sulphurous air clutched at his throat with every inhalation, reminding him of the punitive nature of this forgotten planet. He was there for an echo, for a shadow dancing on the edge of total annihilation. What he sought was not an artifact or a cultist of chaos undivided, but something more fundamental and more dangerous. The last vestige of a lost Primarch. Not one of those who succumbed to the claws of the warp. Not one of those glorified for their loyalty or cursed for their betrayal, but one of those who simply disappeared. A void in the Imperial tapestry, a gap that echoed in his own spirit, driving him through star systems infested by Xenos and war zones of the Long War. The Inquisitor's motivation was not the salvation of souls or the eradication of obvious heresies, but rather a visceral need for answers. An entire galaxy, plunged into perpetual war and self-imposed ignorance, seemed to revolve around unsolved questions about its founders, its fallen heroes, and its inner demons. He felt this gap more deeply than most. The history of the First Black Crusade, the uncertain fate of Rogel Dawn, the curse of the Butcher's Nails that transformed glory into agony for so many sons of the Emperor. All of this was the tip of an iceberg of pain and mystery. His own nightmares were populated by fragmented visions, screams of space marines in the heat of battle, the silhouette of imposing figures amidst the smoke of war, the insidious hum of the warp corrupting mind and matter. These visions, he knew, were merely echoes of the truth that the Imperium had conveniently swept under the carpet of blind faith. He sought not sanctity, but understanding. He needed to know what had happened, which Primarch had been swept from Imperial memories, and what his fate meant for the future of humanity. The decaying structures he now examined were remnants of a mining outpost, abandoned for millennia, eroded by atmospheric acids and the relentless attack of mutant spores that fed on metal and rock. His eyes scanned every fissure, every faded hieroglyph, every fragment of corrupt data. The legend that had brought him here was as tenuous as a spider's web in a sandstorm, a report from an Imperial patrol of the Dark Age, mentioning an anomalous presence and uncatalogued symbols before contact was lost. Nothing concrete, nothing to justify an Inquisitor's suicidal journey, save for the urgency gnawing at his soul. With every step, Inquisitor Valerius felt the crushing pressure of the hostile environment. The weak light of the distant sun barely penetrated the cloud layer, creating an eternal twilight that hid subtle dangers. Creatures adapted to the toxicity crawled in the shadows, their bioluminescent eyes shining briefly before retreating. They were irrelevant. The true threat lay in the revelation, in the truth that could break the backbone of an already fractured Imperium. What he discovered here could be redemption or ruin. The dust, fine as flour, rose with his steps, marking his passage, while Inquisitor Valerius, a man against the tide of galactic oblivion, continued his search for a ghost, immersed in the darkest of truths. The darkness of the cosmic void, where dying stars and nebulae of primordial dust weave a veil of oblivion, was the unwitting cradle of a seed of gods. Cast adrift by the treacherous currents of the warp, one of the Emperor's 20 sons, destined for glory and tragedy, found his way to a nameless world, an orb of grey stone and poisoned skies. It was not a realm of kings or flourishing Xenos, but a forgotten tomb, where civilizations had turned to dust long before humanity learned to dream of the stars. Here, among colossal ruins and the constant whisper of winds, laden with saltpeter and hopelessness, the unnumbered Primarch landed. His growth was a catalyst of silent chaos. No loving foster family took him in. No organized society molded him. Instead, the planet's relentless gravity and cutting solitude forged a being of unparalleled hardness. He fought to survive against mutant beasts crawling from the depths, creatures twisted by eras of radiation, and, perhaps, by the psychic effluvia of dying civilizations. Every battle was a lesson etched in flesh and bone, every scar a mark of his predestined ascension. There were no rituals, only primal hunger, and the ceaseless need to impose his will upon an environment that yearned for his death. The ferocity radiating from him was almost palpable, an aura of pure predation that drove away even the wildest predators, leaving him isolated in his own terrible majesty. Decades of solitary existence transformed him into a harbinger of death, a demon to the few primitive inhabitants who still clung to life in the planet's bowels. His presence was a dark stain on the desolate landscape, a relentless force of nature that knew neither compassion nor doubt. He was the embodiment of brutality, a reflection of the very world that had spawned him in darkness. Silence was his only confidant. The grinding metal of ancient ruins and the howl of the wind were his symphony. And so he waited, a sleeping storm, until the golden light of the Emperor finally tore through the cloud-laden skies. The arrival of the Great Crusade was not a meeting, but a terrifying discovery. The Emperor, on his flagship, the Bucentaur, felt the anomaly through the darkness of the warp and real space, a psychic signature that was at once familiar and deeply disturbing. When the landing occurred, there was no celebration or acclaim. Instead, the Emperor found a recent battlefield, bodies of unknown xenos and local life forms grotesquely dismembered. In the center of this massacre, bathed in the blood of his victims, stood the unnumbered Primarch, his eyes shining with a wild intensity that was almost a challenge. There was no joy in his recognition, only a cold assessment, an instinctive understanding of the pure and untamed force he represented. The Emperor, confronted with this manifestation of untamed and savage power, pondered the nature of he who was, in essence, his son. There was something in him that was an aberration, a deviation from calculated perfection, an echo of a darker truth about the Primarchs themselves. However, the need of the Crusade was great, and the brute strength of that forgotten son was undeniable. With a somber nod, the Emperor claimed him, christening him not with a grandiose name, but with a pragmatic designation that barely disguised the apprehension. And so, the Unnumbered was reintegrated into the grand design, a dissonant piece in the angelic choir of his brothers, a fundamental crack in the foundation of the Imperium. The seeds of a singular tragedy, different from those awaiting the others, had been planted at the moment of his genesis, promising an existence marked by isolation, violence, and a loyalty tested to the limit of sanity itself. As the Great Crusade surged across the void, an unstoppable tide of Imperial might, it carried with it the shadowed glory of a Primarch whose very presence was a storm of iron and blood. From the moment of his rediscovery, his legion became a spearhead of unparalleled ferocity, their advance a testament to a combat doctrine as devastating as it was deeply unsettling. Worlds fell not just to superior firepower, but to a relentless, visceral onslaught that left no quarter, no hope for capitulation, only annihilation or absolute subjugation. Their victories were absolute, etched in the shattered remnants of Xenos empires and the burning pyres of defiant human worlds. Witness their grim glory on the slagged plains of Viridia Prime, where the psychic horrors of the Sloth were met not with measured tactical retreat, but with a howling, unstoppable charge. The Legiones Astartes of this Primarch moved as a single furious entity, their chain axes a blur, their bolt pistols spitting death, a storm of red and grey descending into the alien ranks. They sought not merely to defeat, but to eradicate, to tear down the enemy with a savage delight that chilled even their brother legions. The air vibrated with the roar of their engines and the wet, terrible symphony of close-quarters combat, a sound that spoke of unbridled aggression and a terrifying refusal to yield. Through the choking dust and the stench of burnt flesh, their grim faces, often contorted in a silent, bloodthirsty rictus, were the last thing countless foes ever saw. This terrible efficiency, this absolute commitment to brutal victory, however, came at a profound cost, one paid not in lives, but in soul. The Primarch, a being forged for war, found himself increasingly estranged, a titan burdened by the very power that defined him and his sons. Within his legion, a terrifying transformation was taking hold, a deepening of their inherent aggression, perhaps fueled by a desperate desire to honor their father's own unspoken anguish. Whispers, hushed and fearful, spoke of the blood frenzy, a state of berserker rage that seized whole companies, turning them into living engines of destruction, indiscriminate in their wrath until every enemy was a pulp. Their methods, initially born of tactical necessity, began to veer into a terrifying art form of slaughter, an almost ritualistic shedding of blood that left no room for subtlety or mercy. The Primarch carried the weight of this burgeoning madness, a silent torment that gnawed at his legendary stoicism. He saw the gleam in his son's eyes, mirroring perhaps the inferno within his own soul, a relentless demand for conflict, for the release only battle could provide. He had sought to temper their inherent ferocity, to channel it, yet the tide was too strong, too ingrained in their very being. The Great Crusade, meant to unite humanity, became for him a seemingly endless parade of necessary atrocities, each conquest a fresh stain on his conscience, each victory a new burden. He saw the monstrous potential within his legion, a reflection of the brutal nature of the galaxy itself, and recognized that while it made them invincible, it also rendered them profoundly isolated. His internal struggle intensified with every campaign. There were moments of stark clarity in the heart of battle, when the roar of the bolters and the clash of ceramites seemed to fade, replaced by a chilling silence within his mind. He would witness his sons tearing through Xenos lines, their movements a horrifying dance of death, and a profound weariness would settle upon him. Was this truly the destiny he sought? Was this unyielding, relentless savagery the only path to the Imperium's glory? The very virtues that made them so potent, their courage, their strength, their unyielding spirit, were being twisted, warped by the constant exposure to war's darkest heart. He often stood on command decks, staring out at the burning remnants of a newly pacified world, the distant glow of fires reflecting in his eyes, a grim testament to his dominion. He was a god of war, a living legend, yet the glory felt hollow, tasting of ash and despair. The laughter of his sons, a raw, guttural sound that spoke of satisfaction after slaughter, sometimes struck him as a foreign language, alien and disturbing. The other Primarchs saw his legion's victories and admired their ferocity, but few, if any, truly understood the shadow that lengthened with each triumph, the quiet despair of a father watching his children embrace a path that seemed to offer only endless, self-consuming rage. The Great Crusade continued its relentless push, ever onward, and with it, the Primarch's inner conflict deepened, a silent, growing storm beneath the surface of his formidable will. The ceaseless drumbeat of war had long replaced the rhythm of peace in the galaxy. For a Primarch, born of fire and starlight, forged for conquest, each triumph felt less like victory and more like another stone laid upon a cairn of forgotten ideals. The Great Crusade, once a beacon of unity and reason, had devolved into an endless, brutal grind, its noble tenets eroded by the very ferocity required to enforce them. World after world fell, not to enlightenment, but to the crushing might of the Imperium's legions, their compliance often bought with rivers of blood and the ashes of ancient cultures, the weight of countless lives extinguished, of civilizations remade or utterly annihilated, pressed down upon the demigod's soul, a psychic burden no biological enhancement could shield him from. The grand vision of a unified humanity, broadcast from Terra, seemed a distant, cruel joke amidst the screams of burning populations and the metallic tang of void-stained blood that clung to every battlefield. Beneath the flawless ceramite of their armor, the Space Marines, once proud crusaders, were slowly becoming something else entirely, instruments of absolute destruction, their purpose distilled to pure, unthinking obedience. Their Primarch, observing this grim transformation, felt a gnawing void open within his own chest. He had seen the horrors of Xenos butchery, the insidious threat of renegade cults, but increasingly, he saw the mirror image of such brutality reflected in the Imperium's own methods. He witnessed the zealous purges, the arbitrary judgments, the casual indifference to suffering in the name of a larger, ever more abstract good. The very tools meant to liberate humanity, like the terrible implants that twisted some of his brothers into living weapons, the crude mechanisms of the butcher's nails tearing at a warrior's mind, spoke of a deeper, more fundamental flaw in the Imperium's design, a self-defeating violence inherent in its every breath. The cold, logical efficiency of Imperial justice was indistinguishable from tyranny when viewed from the shattered ruins of a newly compliant world. It was into this fertile ground of disillusionment and suppressed rage that the whispers began to seep. They were not born of physical presence, not yet, but rather currents in the psychic ether, subtle distortions in the fabric of thought that mirrored the Primarch's deepest doubts. They spoke of freedom from a hypocritical master, of a truer path to power, of an escape from the relentless, soul-crushing sacrifice that yielded only more war. The warp, ever a predatory ocean, pulsed with the echoes of his own despair, reflecting back a distorted truth, a tempting lie. These were not the crude temptations of raw power, but the insidious promise of meaning, of justice on his own terms, unburdened by the Emperor's cold, distant decree. They offered solace from the burden of command, a balm for the wounds inflicted by a father who seemed to demand everything and offer little but unending duty. Each fallen world, each unaddressed grievance, each atrocity committed in the Imperium's name, chipped away at the crumbling edifice of his loyalty. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into coherent forms, suggesting an alternative, a way to mend what was broken, to forge a destiny free from the gilded cage of Imperial servitude. They hinted at cosmic powers, at ancient truths suppressed by the Emperor, at a grander tapestry of existence obscured by the mundane dogma of Imperial truth. This was the moment of profound moral choice, a crossroads where the path of arduous, thankless loyalty diverged sharply from the alluring, forbidden avenues of self-determination and unchecked power. A unique temptation, tailor-made for his particular torment, presented itself, not merely to overthrow, but to remake, to salvage beauty from the destruction, or perhaps simply to finally be understood and appreciated in a universe that had only ever demanded, never given. The air grew heavy with unspoken promises. The void itself seemed to hum with a nascent, terrible energy. The silence that followed a particularly brutal campaign, usually a respite, became charged with a new, dangerous stillness, pregnant with choice. He looked upon his legion, upon the weary faces of his sons, and saw not just warriors, but reflections of his own suffering. And in that reflection, the whispers found purchase. The seeds of heresy took root, nurtured by a fatalistic despair. The loyalty that had once been an unbreakable oath began to unravel, thread by agonizing thread, not in a sudden blaze of defiance, but in a slow, insidious corrosion, a tragic concession to a perceived higher calling, or perhaps simply a desperate embrace of the only escape from an unbearable fate. The shadow of chaos, undivided, stretched long, beckoning him into its embrace, promising a twisted form of liberation, ensuring that the galaxy would never again know peace. In the twilight of the Horus Heresy, when the galaxy bled under the weight of a civil war of cosmic proportions, a chapter in the history of humanity was not merely written in blood, but torn from the very tapestry of existence. Amidst the ceaseless roar of orbital bombardments and the dying wail of scorched worlds, the loss of an entire legion of space marines and their Primarch was not the only tragedy, but its nature remained an abyss. There was no last bastion defended to the last man, nor glorious annihilation in an explosion of bolters and energy blades. There was only silence, a sudden and brutal gap that swallowed the 20th Legion, the Alpha Legion, and its elusive Primarch, Alpharius Omegon, leaving behind only the cold void of doubt and the ghostly echo of a shapeless secret. It was a time when betrayal was common currency and loyalty a costly luxury. At a critical turning point of the heresy, the Emperor's forces struggled to contain Horus's inexorable advance. The 20th Legion, masters of stealth and deception, vanished from the sight and military mind of the Imperium. There were no bodies to count, nor shipwreckage to catalogue among the endless debris fields floating in the stellar vacuum. A fleet of impressive proportions, hundreds of thousands of warriors, their peerlessly witty Primarch, simply ceased to be. The last communications were fragmented, obscured by warp interference or the twisted screams of war. And then, a cutting nothingness. It was as if a cosmic scalpel had excised a vital segment of reality, leaving no scar, only absence. The void they left was filled not by battle reports, but by a chorus of terrified whispers. Rumors, as indescribable as the legion that inspired them, circulated through scattered fleets and isolated outposts. Some said they had been swallowed by a rift in the warp, their souls torn apart in an oblivion that transcended death. Others, more paranoid, murmured of a betrayal so deep it involved a complete escape, an abandonment of the conflict itself for obscure and unimaginable purposes. Had they succumbed to some primordial Xenos trap, to the malignant ingenuity of the Dark Aeldari, or to some older abomination? Or had the intrigue of the Alpha Legion itself become so complex, so labyrinthine, that they had lost themselves in their own machinations? For the staggering Imperium, barely clinging to sanity as the war dragged on, the disappearance was a double blow. The loss of an irreplaceable military force and an open wound in the collective psyche. The horror of total annihilation was one thing. The enigma of traceless dissolution was another, far more disturbing. The information void was quickly filled by a ruthless Imperial directive. All records related to the 20th Legion were classified, censored, and then, over time, completely expunged from accessible archives. It became a taboo name, a chapter torn not only from history, but from permitted memory itself. The Primarch, a strategic genius, his legion, the masters of camouflage, became nothing more than shadows in forbidden folios, their names barely uttered in dusty corridors by archivists who feared the fury of forced ignorance. This abrupt absence, this disappearance, forever altered the fabric of the galaxy. It left not only a gap in the Imperial battle lines, but a lingering scar on the soul of the Imperium, a chilling reminder that even humanity's greatest champions could be erased without a trace, their stories stolen by obscurity. The post-heresy galaxy, already a purgatory of dim light and palpable fear, was haunted by this absence, a constant reminder of the fragility of existence, the arbitrary brutality of the cosmos, and the insidious danger of the unknown. The silence of the Imperium, then, became more deafening than any battle cry, a somber policy to contain the truth of a disappearance that could not be explained, only feared. Even more insidious than the shadow of open traitors was the sore of the lost Primarchs, a festering wound in the heart of the Imperium that refused to heal. Their absence was not simply the lack of a leader or a divinely graced warrior, it was a metaphysical void, a deafening silence that permeated every sphere of Imperial existence. The fall of a Primarch, the unexplained disappearance, or the revelation of their own unfathomable corruption were not mere facts to be recorded, but existential cataclysms that threatened to destabilize the foundations of faith in the Emperor's divinity and the incorruptibility of his sons. The cost of such loss was immeasurable. Not only did the legions they led, now fractured and transformed into Space Marine chapters, carry the burden of their absence, but the entire structure of Imperial governance buckled under the weight of an unsustainable secret. The pain of loss, the rage of betrayal, or the terror of an unknown fate were contagious emotions, capable of undermining the cohesion of an empire already weakened by the heresy. In response, the Imperium, in its calculating coldness, did not mourn its absent sons, but purged them. A systematic purge was orchestrated with icy efficiency, sweeping any trace of their existence from Imperial records. The faces of the lost Primarchs, once stamped on monuments and venerated in shrines, were defaced, their statues toppled and turned to dust. Their names were scratched from sacred tomes, their legends rewritten with black holes where once there was glory. Complete archives were burned in subterranean chambers, the ashes scattered in spatial voids, a physical denial of their past reality. Those who dared whisper their forbidden names, who kept fragments of their iconography, or who clung to unauthorized narratives of their deeds, were hunted relentlessly by the darkest agencies of the Adeptus Terra. The Inquisition, still in its infancy, found one of its darkest purposes in the eradication of memory, imposing an edict of oblivion so vast and absolute that even the mere contemplation of their existence was anathema. The terror, however, did not lie solely in the punishment for remembering, but in the very nature of their unknowable fate. For the masses, for the countless billions who comprised the Imperium, the lack of a recorded end for these demigods was more frightening than the most brutal of deaths. They simply vanished, disappeared amidst the fury of the long war, or were swallowed by the turbulent tides of the warp, or lost in forgotten crusades on the distant edges of the galaxy. The truth was a void, a deafening official silence that, paradoxically, created more questions than answers. This vacuum was fertile ground for the darkest speculations, for humanity's most primal fears. And in this void, in this carefully imposed silence, shadows stirred. The gaps in Imperial history, the gaps in official theology, did not remain unoccupied. They were inevitably filled by the most insidious and blasphemous whispers of chaos undivided. Where the Imperium saw the need to hide, chaos saw an opportunity to corrupt. The absence of an imperial explanation left the door open for the temptations of the cult, for the promise of power or knowledge offered by the dark gods, who thrived on hopelessness and ignorance. If a Primarch could simply disappear, what did that say about the safety of his subjects? If a divine hero could be swept from existence, what did that imply for the insignificance of human life? The dread of the unknown was a portal, and through it, the rot of the warp insinuated itself, promising the desperate the answers the Empire had refused to give, leading them into the darkness of no return. Through dead, star-choked voids, and the choking, dust-laced air of forgotten worlds, the Inquisitor's hunt had spiraled into an abyss of his own making. Each step deeper into the Xenos ruins, each fragment of a psychically scarred data log, recovered from warp-tainted star forts, chipped away at the edifice of his sanity. The path he walked was less a trail and more a fever dream, woven from the dying whispers of ancient civilizations and the malevolent laughter of entities that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. He sought answers to a madness that had consumed a Primarch, and in doing so he had begun to mirror that very descent, his purpose blurring with the insidious influence he so desperately tried to track. The echoes of the long war reverberated not just in the derelict battlefields he traversed, but within the confines of his own skull. He'd followed the phantom trails of a lost legion, their final tragic campaign etched into the very fabric of space-time, a testament to extreme psychological duress endured by space marines abandoned by their emperor and corrupted by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The Inquisitor, once a beacon of unyielding faith, found his own convictions eroding under the relentless tide of cosmic horror. The silence of dead worlds was never truly silent, filled instead with the insidious suggestions of chaos undivided, whispers promising answers in exchange for just a sliver of his soul. He fought them with every fiber of his being, yet the constant struggle was itself a torment, a spiritual butcher's nails tearing at his psyche. He had started with cold data, with archaeoforensics and intercepted warp messages, but the quest had long since become personal. He saw the Primarch's despair reflected in the shattered frescoes of alien temples, in the desperate, hastily scrawled last testaments of dying mortals. The overwhelming sense of abandonment, of a universe turning its back on those who sacrificed everything, settled heavy in his chest, like the gravitational pull of a dying star. His sleep, when it came, offered no respite, merely a continuation of the hunt through dreamscapes, where the lines between loyalty and betrayal, sanity and insanity, dissolved into a terrifying, formless void. He remembered the teachings, the unwavering resolve of Rogel Dawn facing the heresy. Yet even Dawn had known profound loss and the bitter taste of a galaxy steeped in eternal war. The Inquisitor felt a kinship with that ancient agony, a dark understanding blossoming from his own unraveling. His resources dwindled, his contacts either dead or driven mad by the very clues they unearthed. He was alone, a solitary figure against the boundless horror of the galaxy, carrying the weight of a secret that threatened to engulf him. The air on these cursed worlds tasted of rust and ozone, a metallic tang that never left his tongue, a reminder of the countless battles fought and lost, the unending cycle of brutality. He pressed on, not out of duty alone, but from a desperate need to understand, to quantify the very nature of the spiritual malady that could twist even a godlike being. He was no longer just an inquisitor. He was a pilgrim on a road to damnation, seeking salvation in the heart of the abyss. Each step, though purposeful, was also a surrender, a deeper plunge into the very darkness he had sworn to purge. The cost of his obsession was laid bare. His humanity, his peace, his very identity. He was becoming a reflection of the lost, a testament to the fact that in the 41st millennium, even the most resolute defenders of mankind could be dragged into the maelstrom, to face the horrifying truth that some terrors, once glimpsed, never truly let go. The suffocating embrace of the crypt's ancient air clung to the Space Marines as they descended, a chill far deeper than mere temperature seeping into their very ceramite. Millennia of forgotten misery and malevolent energies had etched themselves into the very stone, each step echoing not just their heavy boots, but the ghost whispers of 1,000 agonies. The passage narrowed, twisting like a diseased gut, until it opened into a vast cavernous chamber, its architecture alien and grotesque, a testament to a blasphemous union of Imperial ingenuity, twisted by the raw, unfettered power of the warp. Luminescent fungi, an unnatural pulsing violet, cast ghastly shadows across walls adorned with flayed skin and crude pictograms depicting impossible agony. At the chamber's heart, a monstrous edifice of rusted iron and screaming adamantium jutted from the floor, pulsing with a sick internal light. It was a cacophony of fused blades, serrated edges, and barbed wires, all converging on a single obsidian sarcophagus. Before it, hunched and twitching, were its guardians, not flesh and blood cultists, but spectral mockeries of what might once have been world eaters, their forms flickering like heat haze, their eyes burning with perpetual, unslaked rage. They did not speak, but their presence was a silent howl, a wave of pure, concentrated fury that slammed into the Space Marines' minds, threatening to unravel their very sanity. One of the spectral figures lunged, a phantom axe cleaving through the air with a soundless shriek. The Space Marines responded with the grim precision of veterans, bolters roaring, chainswords a blur of desperate motion. But these were not solid foes. Their forms dissolved and reformed, each strike met with a chilling resistance that hinted at the ethereal nature of their torment. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and the coppery tang of nascent madness. Every swing, every shot felt like striking against a memory, against a lingering echo of untold suffering that had been curdled into a defensive barrier. The conflict was not merely physical, it was a battle against the very despair that permeated the crypt, a struggle against the corrosive influence of a Primarch's enduring agony. As the spectral guardians recoiled, momentarily dispersed by the sheer volume of focused firepower, the true horror within the obsidian sarcophagus was revealed. It was not the majestic, broken form of a Primarch, nor the skeletal remains of a demigod. Instead, it was a colossal, intricate device, a horrifying symphony of pain. Thousands of razor-sharp implants, identical in their cruel design to the infamous butcher's nails, were embedded into the interior of the sarcophagus, each one connected by pulsating cables of dark, organic matter to a central, throbbing core. This core did not just hum with power, it wept with it, a continuous, low-frequency thrum that vibrated through their armor, through their bones, and into the very marrow of their souls. It was a resonance of pure, concentrated rage and sorrow, an infernal machine crafted to capture and amplify the psychic scream of a legion, of a Primarch, forever. This was the relic of oblivion, a profane mirror to the butcher's nails, not merely an instrument of pain, but a monument to the ultimate tragic devolution of a son of the Emperor. It was a physical manifestation of a Primarch's shattered will, a fragment of his very being distilled into an artifact of perpetual torment. The air around it shimmered, not with heat, but with the pressure of a million unspoken curses, a million battles fought in a red haze, a million minds broken and reformed into instruments of pure, unthinking destruction. The device pulsed, and with each beat, the Space Marines felt the echo of an inhuman roar, a lament of betrayal and madness that transcended time and space. This was the brutal end, the devastation of a legion, captured and immortalized in an unholy engine, its purpose unknown, its potential for destruction unimaginable. It was a chilling testament to the depth of the heresy's scars, a wound that continued to fester, poisoning the galaxy long after the traitors had claimed their damned eternal rewards. The air in the forbidden chamber thickened, not with dust or the scent of ancient scrolls, but with a palpable dread that seeped into Kaelin's bones. The Inquisitor's mind, sharpened by centuries of traversing the darkest currents of the Imperium, now struggled with something far older and more terrifying. The psychic echoes, carefully extracted from the fractured artifact of unknown Xenos origin, were coalescing, forming not just images, but raw, unfiltered emotions, a storm of despair, defiance, and a terrible, tearing sorrow. This was not mere history. It was a memory to be relived, a wound reopened in the fabric of time. Then, the vision surged, overwhelming the Inquisitor's carefully constructed mental barriers. Kaelin was cast into a whirlwind of light and shadow, the screams of dying men and the guttural roars of demons tearing at the very fabric of existence. It was a battlefield, unlike any recorded in Imperial archives, a labyrinthine horror where reality twisted and contorted with every step. The webway, Kaelin realized with a shock that threatened to shatter his sanity, its crystalline paths now shattered and bleeding, invaded by something unnameable. Amidst the chaos, a colossal figure moved with terrifying grace and speed, a whirlwind of white and crimson against the emerald and obsidian of the alien pathways. It was a Primarch, clad in battle-scarred ceramite, his face a mask of grim determination, even as his blade, the cage of the white scars, cut through ranks of Xenos and demons. This was the Great Khan, Jagatai, a legend whispered to have disappeared into the alien realm, his final fate a mystery. But here, in this agonizing echo, his fate was being revealed. The sounds were deafening, the guttural war cries of the white scars, their thunderous bolters tearing flesh and chitin, the metallic, crackling laughter of the dark Eldar, their cruel blades dancing with impossible speed, and underneath it all, a soul-twisting sound, the insidious whisper of the warp, seeping through fractured dimensions, promising power, offering oblivion. Jagatai fought not only against physical threats, but against the crushing weight of inevitable loss, the knowledge that this battle was a delay, not a victory. Flashbacks within flashbacks assaulted Kaelin. The Khan, witnessing his sons being dragged screaming into shimmering portals, their souls devoured by unseen horrors, tactical retreats turning into desperate flights, the terrible calculus of sacrifice, where every life saved meant countless others condemned. The air tasted of ozone and blood, the metallic taste of fear thick on the tongue. The ground beneath Kaelin's phantom feet shook with the impact of monstrous hooves and the concussive force of void weapons. The warp, ever hungry, was tearing at the very edges of the webway, its malevolent energies manifesting as grotesque and mutable entities that mocked and tormented. The Primarch pressed on, an avatar of fury and sorrow, his speed unmatched, his blade a blur against the encroaching darkness. He sought something, a critical junction point, a vital nexus that, if secured, could stem the tide. Hope, a flickering and defiant ember, still burned in his luminous eyes, even as the scale of horror threatened to extinguish it forever. But the enemy was too vast, too ancient, too insidious. As Kaelin watched, transfixed by the psychic torrent, the Khan found his objective, a shimmering gate, the last bastion of a desperate defense. Yet, blocking his path was not a mere demon, but an entity of impossible power, a greater demon of Slanesh, its form a mockery of grace, its laughter 1,000 piercing needles against the mind. The duel was a symphony of destruction and despair. Jagatai, for all his unmatched skill, was up against an impossible enemy, one that fed on emotion, on suffering, on the very defiance he embodied. The demon's whips, imbued with the agony of 1,000 devoured souls, cracked and lashed, tearing his armor, seeking his flesh. Every strike was not just physical, it was a psychic assault, a probe into the Khan's deepest fears, the loss of his legion, the failure of his emperor, the crushing weight of the long war. In a final desperate lunge, the Great Khan delivered a blow that would have sundered a starship, a strike born of pure, unadulterated defiance. He clove the demon, sending it screaming back into the warp. But the victory was hollow. The gate, already compromised by the encroaching malevolence, shuddered, collapsing inward, taking with it the last strands of sanity of the besieged webway passage. Jagatai, caught in the tearing vortex, turned his gaze back to the retreating shadows of his surviving sons. A fleeting, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, of a burden accepted, of a sacrifice made. And then Kaelan heard it. Not a roar of defiance, nor a cry of pain, but a sound infinitely more tragic. It was the Primarch's last cry of hope, a guttural, tearing vocalization, not for himself, but for the future, for a galaxy he knew was forever condemned to eternal war, but which he, for this fleeting moment, had protected at an unimaginable cost. The psychic echo reverberated, not as a sound wave, but as a deep, profound tremor in Kaelan's very soul. The Inquisitor recoiled from the artifact, the chamber now silent save for his own gasping breaths. The truth about the lost Primarch's fate was not a glorious apotheosis, but a desperate and agonizing descent into the gullet of the warp. A sacrifice so terrible it defied the very concept of heroism, leaving Kaelan with a soul-crushing burden and the chilling realization that in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there were no easy answers, only brutal, endless choices, and the constant, relentless attrition of war. In the frigid vastness of the cosmos, where the light of billions of stars drowns in the darkness of perpetual war, the cruelest truth of the 41st millennium is not the incessant brutality, nor the insatiable hunger of demonic gods, but rather the overwhelming and total indifference of the universe. It is an abyss that swallows legacies, devours heroisms, and transforms the suffering of eras into mere grains of dust swept by stellar winds. Not even the most glorious of Primarchs, demigods born of the Emperor's own flesh and spirit, are immune to this devastating truth. Their sacrifices, their titanic victories, and their epic falls are, to the impassive cosmos, merely distant noises in a symphony of eternal agony. Think of Rogel Dawn, the unyielding bulwark of terror, whose uncompromising devotion to the Imperium was as vast as the fortresses he erected. He, who held the line against the tide of traitors in the Horus Heresy, whose grief for the fall of his brothers was palpable even to a being so stoic, met his end or disappearance in veiled circumstances, his legend consumed by the shadows of the First Black Crusade. His body, supposedly found in pieces on the bridge of a Chaos battleship, was not so much a monument to his final bravery, but a testament to the ultimate futility of his resistance. He who defended humanity with every fiber of his being was, in the end, reduced to fragments, the glory of his sacrifice diminished by the galaxy's inability to even fully register his final lament. His legacy, once a beacon of hope and resilience, became another tale of tragedy, echoing in the void, almost forgotten. The saga of the Primarchs, both loyal and traitorous, is a tapestry woven with threads of broken hope and perpetual suffering. Angron, chained to the butcher's nails, exemplifies the mindless fury and endless agony that became the essence of his legion, the World Eaters. His curse was not only his, but that of every space marine who embraced the nails, transforming them into ruthless killing machines whose minds were an inferno of constant pain. The warp, with its insane logic and malleable reality, is not an agent of judgment, but a magnified mirror of inner darkness, uncaring of justice or redemption. The traitor legions, who fell into the clutches of chaos undivided, found a liberation that was, in truth, enslavement to an even more heinous cycle of violence and corruption. They traded one master for a myriad of demons, and their torment became a feast for entities that know no empathy, only appetite. The darkness of the 41st millennium is not just the shadow of war machines and the acidic mist of battlefields, but an existential darkness that permeates every soul. It is the understanding that, no matter how great the hero, how deep the faith, or how devastating the betrayal, the vastness of the galaxy will remain unmoved. The fate of billions, the fall of empires, the rise of new Xenos, threats like the Necrons awakening from their tomb worlds or orc swarms sweeping through systems, all is part of an endless stream of chaos and destruction that possesses no final purpose beyond its own perpetuation. The scream of a billion souls sacrificed to feed the Imperium is indistinguishable from the whisper of a single warrior dying in the depths of an asteroid field. The galaxy does not listen, it does not care. In this nihilistic void, where hope is an illusion and victory, when achieved, is merely a brief postponement of the next catastrophe, the only constant is war. There is no end in sight, no ultimate redemption for humanity, only the certainty that the struggle will continue, grim and visceral, until the galaxy consumes itself. It is a universe that punishes aspiration, mocks sacrifice, and reminds us, in every bloody moment, that we are merely pawns in a game that has no audience, only insane players and a doomed board. Subscribe to the Lore Entertainment and Animated Narrated Stories channel for more tales from the grim darkness of the far future, where the only certainty is the clangor of war and cosmic indifference.